What is an evangelical? Well, according to the media, it's any Protestant who likes Trump. Hey guys, welcome back to KingdomCraft, where I build this church in Minecraft while talking about Christianity. Today I'm still working on my underground cave chapel underneath the main church, and today I'm talking about evangelicals, because it's hard to define what an evangelical is. A lot of people mean different things when they use the word evangelical, so I'm going to go over like 4 or 5 definitions of evangelical, then I'm going to explain the way I use the word evangelical and why I don't consider myself an evangelical. So, to make it even more confusing, evangelical doesn't even necessarily mean Protestant. Most of the time when people say evangelical, they're referring to some type of Protestants. But really, all Christians would historically consider themselves evangelical, like lowercase e, evangelical, because evangel in evangelical just means the gospel, and all Christians claim to believe the gospel, except like the really liberal ones. You have to be a really liberal Christian to admit you don't believe the gospel. The more moderate liberals are like, oh no, we do believe the gospel, we just think everyone was wrong about sexuality until last week. But evangelical just means gospel-believing, so in some sense even Catholics and Orthodox Christians would claim to be evangelical, but they normally wouldn't use that word, because normally when people say evangelical they mean some type of Protestant, even though there's many definitions. Now, originally, in the early days of the Reformation, evangelical was synonymous with Protestant. It just meant any type of Protestant at all. In fact, the Reformers called themselves evangelicals. They considered themselves the true Catholic Church, so they called themselves evangelical Catholics, meaning Catholics who believe the gospel. The word Protestant was originally used as an insult, because like, oh, you're not real Catholics, you're protesting the Catholic Church, and then the name kind of stuck. Oh, there's lava. Generally, most names for denominations start out as insults. Like the two main types of Protestants in the beginning were Lutherans and Calvinists. You didn't have all these Baptists and non-denominationals back then. It was mainly Lutherans and Calvinists. And Lutherans and the words Lutheran and Calvinist were insults they gave each other to say, you follow Luther, I follow Christ. No. You follow Calvin, I follow Christ. That's the way it started. So yeah, Lutheran and Calvinist and Protestant were all originally meant to be insults. They weren't things that people thought of for themselves. But yeah, they called themselves evangelical. So, in the early days of the Reformation, evangelical just meant Protestant, and in Europe, that's still the case. If you're walking around the streets of Europe and you see an evangelical church, if you see a sign for an evangelical church, chances are that's a really good base church. I would recommend you go there. Generally, the more non-denominational churches that Americans would call evangelical aren't going to be called an evangelical church in Europe. They're going to be called something like Grace Bible Church. I'd recommend staying away from those. But yeah, so in Europe today, evangelical just means Lutheran and Reformed. If you go to like the old historic Lithuanian Reformed Church in Lithuania, and Lithuania is very based, it's gonna be solid and Reformed. It's gonna be called an Evangelical Reformed Church, the Lithuanian Reformed Evangelical Church. Or if you're in Germany and you see like a Lutheran church, it's probably going to be called the Evangelical Lutheran Church. And that's why the ELCA denomination, which is very much not an evangelical denomination, it's a mainline Protestant denomination in America, it's still called the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America because of that European Lutheran heritage, where evangelical just means Protestant, right? So that's one definition. But then later on, the word evangelical was used by the revivalists in the Second Great Awakening. In America, when there was the awakenings, especially the Second Great Awakening, there were these preachers that were doing all these experimental methods, trying to appeal to people's emotions. They focused a lot more on emotions and human reason than actual doctrine. So they became called the evangelicals. The evangelicals were less committed to any denominational distinctives and more focused on just saving as many souls as possible. So that's like the first seeds of modern evangelicalism, I think, was during the Second Great Awakening. During the Second Great Awakening, there were also some movements that were even more extreme than the revivals. That's when the Restorationist movement started, and although the Restorationists weren't exactly called evangelicals, they came around the same time. The Restorationists gave us the Church of Christ and Disciples of Christ denominations. They were trying to rebuild Christianity from scratch, and that's also when non-denominationalism was invented. Non-denominationalism does not come from the Protestant Reformation. It comes from the Restorationist movement, which was trying to like complete completely rebuild Christianity from scratch. That's not what the Protestant Reformation was about. The Protestant Reformation was about staying in the Catholic Church. At least they wanted to stay in, they got kicked out. But it was about continuing Catholicism, but just reforming it. But anyway, evangelicals in the Second Great Awakening were the people that supported the Second Great Awakening, were the people that were participating in the Second Great Awakening. So in the Presbyterian Church, we had a split into the old school and the new school. There were people that were supporting the revivals in the Presbyterian Church, but generally, like, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church didn't like that, so they got kicked out of the Presbyterian Church for supporting revivals. So the new school Presbyterians got kicked out for supporting revivals, and then the old school Presbyterians, meaning the ones who kicked them out, they were very anti-revivalist. So yeah, that's when the word evangelical began to develop, in reference to like a specific type of Protestant, and not just Protestants overall. Then we get into the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, with the fundamentalist modernist controversy. And the fundamentalists were really trying to hold to the traditional beliefs of Christianity. The modernists wanted to change everything. But the fundamentalists weren't just traditionalists, they also were kind of anti-intellectual in certain ways. And they were also very retreatist. After modernism began to take over the institutions and succeeded in taking over the institutions, the fundamentalists largely just retreated from all the institutions. They retreated from culture, and they were very strict about their denominational distinctives. But then, about in the mid-20th century, there was a group of fundamentalists who still wanted to be fundamentalist, who still wanted to be, like, conservative and hold to the essentials of Christianity, but they didn't like how fundamentalists were so isolationist and sectarian. They wanted to sort of have liberty in some of the non-essential issues, so they became the Neo-evangelicals. Prominent Neo-evangelicals are like Billy Graham and the Christianity Today magazine, which actually comes from the PCUSA. That was a prominent Neo-evangelical publication. So yeah, the Neo-evangelicals were fundamentalists who became a bit less fundamentalist, still fundamentally fundamentalist, but also the Neo-evangelicals weren't in favor of segregation like most of the fundamentalists were. So evangelicals ended up being fundamentalists with better PR. Really, they were called the Neo-evangelicals, but eventually the name just got shortened to evangelical. So far we have three definitions of evangelical. In the 1600s and the 1500s, evangelical was just another word for Protestant. In the 1800s, evangelical was a word for people who supported the revivals. And then in the 1900s, evangelical was short for neo-evangelical, meaning fundamentalists who wanted to engage with the world a little bit more. And each of these definitions comes closer and closer to the modern definition. So now, in the modern world, evangelical has been a word used by the media to distinguish mainline Protestants from other Protestants. And that is why I'm not evangelical, because I'm a mainline Protestant. Now, it's a bit fuzzy, because generally the media lumps all liberal Protestants in with mainline Protestants, because the mainline denominations have largely drifted liberal. We said in the fundamentalist modernist split, the mainstream institutions got liberal, so that means the conservatives largely retreated from the mainstream institutions. So that means, generally speaking, mainline Protestant denominations are liberal, and non-mainline Protestants, whether they're in some sort of conservative offshoot denomination or whether they're non-denominational, generally the non-mainline Protestants are going to be more conservative, and there is truth to that. But it's not always true. There are some liberal people, some liberal Protestants who are not in the mainline denominations, and there are some people in the mainline denominations like myself who are not liberal. So that means even though the media tries to classify these things, they get it very wrong. They also only classify the white denominations into these things. So the media has like three categories for Protestants. They have mainline Protestant, evangelical Protestant, and historically black Protestant. That's just the way the media works. The media has never really cared about the subtle nuances of Christian theology, in case you couldn't tell. But that's the way that the media uses the word evangelical today. The fourth definition of evangelical is a Protestant who is not a mainline Protestant. So, what does evangelical really mean? Which of those definitions do I use? Well, I sort of lump most of them into the same definition. The first definition is very outdated. So even though evangelical originally just meant Protestant, I don't use that definition anymore. What I do is use the mainstream media's definition of evangelical, meaning a Protestant who is not a mainline Protestant, but I also think evangelical does have a connotation of fundamentalist and revivalist. So I think evangelical can properly refer to the second and third and fourth definitions I gave you. And the reason for that is they often do influence each other. It's not true that every Protestant that's not in the mainline denominations is influenced by fundamentalism and revivalism, but it usually is the case. You'll notice that the mainline Presbyterian church, I'm using Presbyterians as an example because I'm Presbyterian, it's what I'm most familiar with, but you'll see parallels in other denominations too. You'll notice the mainline Presbyterian church, the PCUSA, usually it's liberal, but usually it's not like fundamentalist or revivalist or anything. Usually, PCUSA churches are very beautiful, very traditional in their liturgy, very intellectual, things like that. Whereas most Presbyterian churches that are not in the PCUSA, once again, there's exceptions to all these things, I'm talking about general trends. Generally, Presbyterianism outside the mainline, outside the PCUSA, whether we're talking about the PCA or the EPC or ECO or OPC, is very fundamentalist, meaning it has some anti-intellectual tendencies. It's very revivalist, it has contemporary worship music, it doesn't really have that high liturgy, it has not the best buildings, not because they are poor, even though sometimes they are. Usually they just don't care. They just have more of a Baptistic approach to a lot of things. And I have admitted that Baptists were a lot cooler than I thought. I recently made a video saying I was wrong about Baptists, but you still will see that there's a Baptistic influence that goes along with evangelicalism more broadly speaking. So I know that it's tough to define what an evangelical is, but it's more of a tendency than it is like a strict set of beliefs. Evangelical is not a denomination. Sometimes when I make denomination videos, some people will ask me, oh, where are evangelicals in this video? And the answer is that evangelical is not a denomination, it's just a tendency. I think it's the evangelicalizing tendency to move away from the established institutions in favor of, like, more pious Christianity. So that's what I would describe evangelicalism as, because that's the common theme in the second, third, and fourth definition of evangelical. All three of those definitions are a move away from traditional institutional Christianity and towards a more individualized, personal, and supposedly pious Christianity. For the awakenings in the Second Great Awakening, the second definition we're talking about, it was a move away from liturgy and sacraments and doctrine and more towards experimental revival practices. If we're talking about the evangelicals who emerged from the fundamentalist movement, the fundamentalists who got a bit nicer than some of the other fundamentalists, the fundamentalists were born out of conservative Christians retreating from the mainstream institutions. And if we're talking about evangelical in the modern definition of not mainline, it is still conservatives who retreated from the mainline Protestant denominations. So in all three senses, evangelicalism denotes a sort of move away from the traditional Christian institutions. And what my page is all about is reviving institutional Christianity. And I've talked a lot about how a lot of young men are becoming Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. I don't think that's because Protestantism is bad, because if I thought that, I wouldn't be Protestant. I do think institutional Christianity is what we need right now in this chaotic world, and institutional Protestantism has been greatly weakened by so many conservative Christians retreating from the institutional Protestant churches. So that's why I'm all about Operation Reconquista, of conservatives moving back into the mainline Protestant churches and trying to revive institutional Protestantism. So because the word evangelical almost always has a connotation of moving away from institutional Protestantism, whether that's due to modern conservative retreatism or fundamentalist retreatism, or just due to a move away from traditional institutional Christianity and towards emotional revivals, either way, fundamentalism, revivalism, and modern-day conservative offshoots, all of them are not very good for institutional Christianity. All of them support a decentralization of Christianity. All of them support an individualization of Christianity. And I think that's a common theme in evangelicalism. So my point here is, no matter what definition of evangelical you use, unless you're just talking about Protestants generally speaking, I just can't call myself an evangelical. Yes, I am conservative in some sense, meaning I believe in conserving traditional Christian doctrines and morality. That's true. But there's just such an anti-intellectual and anti-institutional connotation to the word evangelical that I don't want to apply it to myself. Now, what's the alternative? What do you call Christians who want to be traditional or conservative, but not be evangelical or fundamentalist, and still stay in the mainline Protestant denominations? Now, I can just call myself a traditional Presbyterian. I think the word traditional is better than, like, conservative, because conservatives never conserve anything. But being traditional doesn't necessarily mean you're some sort of reactionary fundamentalist. It just means you care about being in the tradition. You care about being faithful to the tradition. So I think traditional Presbyterian is a good enough... If I have to put an adjective before the word Presbyterian, it would be traditional. But in terms of, like, what movement do I think was best, I think it was the Neo-Orthodox movement. In the 20th century, there were sort of, like, 4 factions. There were the fundamentalists, which we talked about. There were the neo-evangelicals. There were the modernist liberals. But then there's also the Neo-Orthodox. The Neo-Orthodox people were largely very intellectual scholars in the mainline institutions who never retreated from them, but they started to become very critical of liberalism. Now, Karl Barth is the main figure associated with the Neo-Orthodoxy, but there's so many other figures too. There's T.F. Torrance, there's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, there's Jürgen Moltmann, and, I mean, Jürgen Moltmann is basically a liberal himself. I shouldn't have used him as an example. There's Emil Brunner. There's Donald Blesch, who is very conservative and still would probably identify as neo-Orthodox. And I think John Williamson Nevin, who's one of those German Reformed Mercersburg theologians, I think he is in many ways a precursor to Neo-Orthodoxy, even though he lived like 100 years before Karl Barth. In fact, he died the year that Karl Barth was born, leading some of us to speculate that Karl Barth is a reincarnation of John Williamson Nevin. I'm just kidding. Even if reincarnation was real, which it's not, that's not possible, because there was like 1 month when Nevin was alive and Karl Barth was also born, so that's not possible. But you get what I mean. I should make another video on comparing the ideas of John Williamson Nevin to Karl Barth. I did talk about him when I talked about Mercersburg theology a few episodes ago. He is, I think, probably the most underrated theologian in all of America. But yeah, you get the idea. So, I'd rather not consider myself an evangelical. Even though evangelicals have good intentions, they're usually just trying to revive biblical Christianity, but I don't think the way to do that is to have a disdain for institutional Christianity. I think what you should do is just reform institutional Christianity and make it better. So that's about it for this video. I don't think I'm going to speed this up because I'm just going to record another video after this, but thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you all later.